Well, as I was working out the order of classes, I was like, yeah, I can do the Beatitudes all in one class. And as I worked on the Beatitudes all in one class, I'm like, yikes. There's a lot to digest and try to get through here this morning. So we're gonna work on it, try to get through it. We're not going to dive super deep into each one. I say each one of the Beatitudes probably could be its own lesson in and of itself. There's just a ton of kind of nuances that each one has and the detail that you can draw from each one. But I think one of the kind of the biggest things I think we want to look at is, if I can get my clicker working, what do you see?
See a nice meadow and some big tall pine trees on the right.
Yeah.
And I don't know, some woods in the back there.
Yeah, it's kind of like me when I wake up without my contacts in, and I go driving to the gym, and I'm like, I think we perspective and focus is something that I think that Jesus is drawing us to. The perspective of this picture, I mean, yeah, you can kind of see what it is. But what Jesus is asking us to do is put on our glasses, to see things differently, to hopefully cause them to come into focus. Go ahead, Mike.
It's not what the angel says to Mary when she conceives, you are highly favored of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very similar, right? It's pertaining to being fortunate or happy because of our circumstances, or pertaining to being favored, especially favored by God. I think it is something that we see here. It's not necessarily happiness in like, are you happy today? But the state of being in favor or being favored by God is a whole different perspective of what it truly means to be blessed. We can see the joy that goes beyond maybe the circumstances we might find ourselves in. I think as we dig into some of these Beatitudes, especially the last couple, I think as we look at these this morning, I think it's a little bit of a progression, right? And you get to the last couple, like, being happy because we're persecuted, that's not what I consider to be happy, but truly finding the blessings and the joy that goes beyond the circumstances that we might find ourselves in this physical life. It's also a picture of what is an ideal life in God's kingdom. I think it's also this idea of already, but not yet. God's favor and comfort are real now, but it's also a look forward. The not yet. Some blessings may not be here on this earth. Some of the joy we might find certainly will not be on this earth, but in the favor we find as we inherit the earth or seeing God points us to an eternal frame of reference. So yes, there are some things that we will see already, here, now, present, but there are some of these blessings or favor that we will seek and see in the future. So that's, again, kind of the framework that I want us to look at this morning is all of these. Jesus is speaking to an audience. We talked a little bit last week. Some of these audience people are Jewish religious leaders, but many are not. Many are some of the outcasts of society. And so when Jesus is looking across this range of humanity, when Jesus is saying, you will find favor by God in these certain attributes or certain ways of thinking, the certain ways of living, it's probably a little bit of a jarring thing to some of the people in the audience. Jesus is not just talking to the religious leaders and the ones that kind of seemingly have it all together. He's also talking to those that are poor and sick and outcasts. And they're hearing the same message, that you can find favor with God. You can find joy that goes beyond the circumstances that you find yourself in right now, where maybe you don't have enough food, you don't have a good shelter. You're struggling to make things go in your life. But don't focus on those things. Focus on finding favor with God. Art?
Putting things in proper perspective, I think is what you're talking about. But sometimes we get nearsighted, or we don't see the big picture of how blessed we truly are.
Very much.
I find sometimes when, even if I don't see it as a blessing in the moment, later I find that it is, even though I don't see it in that moment. Like if something's happening to me, it turns out that that was better for me. So I find just because I don't see being blessed, I feel like is a joyful thing, but I also feel like sometimes if you're not feeling like you're being blessed, you actually are.
Very much. Very much. Any other thoughts before we kind of click into the first one? All right. Verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. I think I need to do an extra click right there. That would have been helpful. As we look about what does the meaning behind this mean, I think it's being poor in spirit. I think you can kind of look at that a lot of different salvation. It's not that what we have done and we have created and done in our own life means that we are able to earn our salvation, to check all the right boxes and make sure that we are appropriate before God, because we will never be in a position of that. I think the other thing is we need to change how we see others. I can't imagine saying a prayer to God and say, I'm so much better than this dude over here that I'm seeing. But I think sometimes the heading on mine says, "Create in me a clean heart, O God." I think David had a lot to be sorrowful for, right? I think as we see Nathan the prophet come to him, he was very like, whoever did this must be punished immediately. And Nathan's like, oh, by the way, it's you. David immediately kind of took the onus on himself. I think that's the huge distinction we can see between him and Saul and these early kings, is David was willing to say, yeah, I was completely wrong. But in our own lives, are we truly mourning over the sin? Found out. I'm embarrassed. I think that attitude that Jesus is asking us to have here, I think if we kind of combine these first two Beatitudes, the poor in spirit who mourn because of what sin has done to God, can only find comfort in Jesus, because sin is a disaster that only God can fix. And I think the other part is we can only find true comfort in what God can give us. The mercy and grace and the forgiveness we can have through Him. If we go seeking comfort, we're not going to find the right, true repentance. Let's look over 2 Corinthians 7 really quickly. Kind of jumped over this spot. Second Corinthians 7, beginning in verse 9. As it is, I rejoice, not because you were grieved, but because you were grieved into repenting. For you felt a godly grief, that you suffered no loss through us. For godly grief produces a repentance that leads us about regret, whereas worldly grief produces death. Are we really truly sorrowful? Are we mourning over what we have done to God, not what happened to us?
Over those that she knew were lost. And so, as important as it is that we mourn over our sin and we self-examine ourselves, I think this verse also speaks to the mourning of those around us, especially if it's people that we really love and care about, such as maybe children, family members that are lost and aren't serving the Lord. I mean, because if you really stop and think about it, we all should be in tears because hell is real. Hell is not make-believe. And if you're not, serving the Lord, then that's the alternative. That's where you're going to end up. And if that's not upsetting, and I know Jesus talked about let's state your message, and if they basically aren't receptive, dust yourself off and move on. But I don't think Jesus did that with this show, this attitude of, well, sucks to be them, and they just don't get it, so too bad. I think he moved on because he knew there was more work to do, but at the same time, and he had things that he needed to get done while he was here on earth. But at the same time, I believe that he was moving forward with still knowing, you've got people with a heavy heart, that there are these people that, for whatever reason, are not responding to his message and accepting this, incredible gift that he, is willing to give. And so I think, and I'm speaking for myself, we need to be very careful as Christians that we don't just, think, oh, well, that's just too bad, they don't get it, or we tried. And because think about how many times God has tried with us. And especially, it's one thing if you have the blessing, like my beautiful great niece Eloise, who's been so blessed to have been born of godly parents. And so she's going to be raised in this wonderful, godly home, God-fearing, Jesus-loving home, which is wonderful. But it's another thing if you weren't raised in that, and somehow God was able to reach you, and you were able to be saved from all that destructiveness and just that horrible life. And then you go on to say, well, these people just don't get it, so we'll only give them so many chances, and then that's it, we're cutting them off. I'm sorry, that's wrong. And I think too often, there's unfortunately too many of us that do that, myself included, so I'm not criticizing others when I say this.
Very good. Adam?
I was just thinking about how probably then and now a lot of us come to Jesus and want just to be a little bit better and to maybe add on some good traits, and that's sometimes how we think of it. And you see in these first three Beatitudes about the poor in spirit and those who mourn and the meek, that Jesus is wanting us to completely break us down and empty us out, and not just view this as let's get a little bit better, let's add a couple new qualities, let's be a little more peaceful, but he wants us to come recognizing that we start with nothing, we have nothing to offer, we are broken, we are messed up, we need to be completely humble and start from that place of emptiness, and then let him fill us back up instead of just trying to tack on a few good things and get a little bit better than we were.
Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. I tried to make this into that was my attempt on all these. We're trying to get a 5-word kind of definition. And in verse 34, I think is probably where we can kind of see the biggest thing. Wait for the Lord. and keep his way, and he will exalt you to inherit the land. And you will look on when the wicked are cut off. We need to put our trust and our thoughts around God's providence and being able to take care of us and ability to drive out the wickedness from in front of us. And the control that we need to exert on ourselves and not just go and attack all those people maybe around us. We need to put it into God's hands. Morgan?
I don't know if this is super obvious, probably to everybody else, but this is the first time I thought of it. I feel like it's all pictures of who Jesus is. Like, every beatitude we've read so far describes him. And I think it's interesting that he still went to the cross and was defeated physically, but God, not just because it's Easter, but God rose him on the third day. And I think I'm just never seen maybe him describing himself, obviously,
Yep.
like we're supposed to emulate him, but like his life was still full of sorrow and suffering, and like all of these traits he's asking us to have are what he had to.
Morgan's reading my notes.
Oh dear.
Very good. Yeah, so the Matthew 11, right, is he's asking us to take on that yoke upon us, take his yoke upon us, but it is not this arduous thing. But very much like a horse, and right, this yoke that we are then under the control and guidance of him. You see the example there in 1 Peter 2, and I won't read it there, but Jesus was looking up to God ahead of the goal, right? He's approaching his conclusion of his mission, which was not something that was pleasant to even contemplate. But Jesus was able to maintain his calmness, his composure, his evenness, even in this difficult situation. And as disciples, he's asking us to do the same thing. To be in control, to be in harmony with him. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Do we have a deep craving for God's will? A deep craving for his justice? A deep craving for his personal holiness? I think none of us probably have ever really been hungry. I can imagine some of the people in this crowd probably had extreme hunger. We see in Psalm 42, as the deer pants for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? Jesus, in John chapter 6, after feeding the 5,000, says the only way ultimately to get true fulfillment, to satisfy the hunger, is to eat the true bread. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Those that desire to live according to God's will and his standards will be filled. We're not going to be filled up by the world's pleasures, by pursuing those things around us that everybody thinks are the best and the brightest and the coolest things. What Jesus is saying is how we will be filled is in righteousness to God and according to his will, not what the world would think. This one's a hard one because it's I think it's very easy to say, well, yeah, sure. I'm following God's will. I am living the right way. But I think what Jesus is saying here, this is not just a, kind of sort of way of thinking and acting and living. This should be something that's driving us every moment of every day. We could probably go a couple days without eating. I know I could. It'd probably be a little helpful for my waistline. But if we went days and days and days without proper nutrition or proper drink, our body would just be craving whatever we could get. Do we have the same want and desire and hunger to be pleasing, to seek after God's righteousness? The ultimate kind of clarity of thought, to the perfection of God's nature. Am I exhibiting the same desire towards living a life pleasing to Him? Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. If you think about what mercy is, it's showing compassion, forgiveness, and generosity. This is interesting as we kind of go through these. So far, these have all been kind of mostly inward focused type of attributes. So it's personally, what am I doing in my relationship towards God? This is the first one that's kind of more outward looking. Matthew chapter 18. We'll kind of skim this a little bit. But we see this is the parable of the unforgiven servant, where we have 10 minutes and we still have about 4 more to go here. But we see this king and has this servant of his has this crazy amount of debt. So much debt that it's hard to even kind of put the numbers around it, right? There's 10,000 talents, and my Bible has like this is like 1,000,000 years of like working, and you're never going to get there. But the servant gets forgiveness from the king. And then he turns around and goes finds a fellow servant who owes him a substantial amount, but nothing from anywhere close to what he was just forgiven for. And he throws him in jail and has zero mercy, zero compassion on him. And what Jesus is asking then is like, why not? As we live our lives, and maybe somebody has done something to us that we don't like, or something against us, or they need some level of forgiveness, are we willing to put ourselves in their shoes? Are we willing to maybe give up the power or the rightness that we may feel towards what we should be getting? Right? This servant, this fellow servant owed him a decent amount of money. He's like, hey, I'm just trying to make things go and like live my life. But I think what we need to have is purely a change of heart. We need to show compassion and forgiveness. And in turn, God is also forgiving us, right? We have received God's mercy, but sometimes we lose that perspective of what we have been forgiven for. But truly living in God's grace means that we are extending that grace to others. Paul Earnhardt writes in his book around this attribute: mercy towards men does not merit mercy from God. but is evident of a penitent spirit, which is a divine condition of forgiveness. Kingdom citizens live among their fellows, not as arrogant spiritual aristocracy, but as forgiven men. I think that's the perspective that we must have. Jesus in Matthew chapter 9, when he's talking to some of the Pharisees and their misguidedness of like what they're doing, what they tithe and do all the right, check all the right boxes. And Jesus is like, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Pure in heart is a way of looking at integrity and sincerity and moral purity. I think it's kind of this distinction between being clean under the old law and being unclean, right? We can see this picture over and over in God's law. We see who will be truly clean and accepted by God is one who has followed those things and has set themselves apart. I think how do we get there? What does that look like in our lives? Is we need to ask God for help. Psalm 51 and verse 10 says, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a spirit that is within me. Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:22 to flee the things that you're going to get in trouble with, those youthful passions. But he doesn't stop there. He doesn't say just empty all the bad stuff out of your life. He goes a second step and says, you need to be pursuing righteousness, faith, love, and peace. And oh, by the way, along with those who call on the Lord with a pure heart. We all have this element of, I can do it by myself. Paul's telling Timothy, like, hey, watch out for these things, pursue these things, but get some good people with you. Continue to work on these things together. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. I think it's not somebody that's just quiet and reserved. I think this is not just a passive type thing. This is an active thing. But go on further to those who are restoring and finding reconciliation. In Romans chapter, here we go, make peace. In Romans chapter 12, if possible, as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Hebrews chapter 12 says, strive for peace with everyone. So I think the questions we need to ask ourselves, am I a person of reconciliation, or am I a person who is dividing? Where can I promote peace more in my life, in my home, in our church, in my workplace? Where can I be at peace with others? Skip the slide here in the middle. The last one is one that's probably the most difficult. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is in heaven, for they persecuted the prophets who came before you. We can see that This life is not going to be one that's easy or comfortable or without trouble and struggles. That living a life according to these principles is going to put us in the crosshairs of the world, and they will come after us. So I think as we have just a few more minutes, here's kind of some of the wrap-up kind of ideas that I want us to kind of draw in totality from these Beatitudes. It's not just a checklist of kind of random thoughts. I think it's a progression of growth as kingdom citizens. Jesus is calling these people that are willing to listen to him to be radically changed in their own lives. To draw a spot where the way that the world is not where you should be pointing. It's a difference. It's be different, be transformed, be moved and motivated in your life to take on this different perspective. We are also kind of on a journey. This is not something that you just kind of flip the switch and it's done. This should be a daily part of how should I live? What should I live? How should I relate to others around me? These are totally different than what the world would have us think of, right? They should challenge on how we think. It should challenge us on how we feel, with the intent of these things draw us closer to God and make us more able to work on his mission, which is to have all people come to the same knowledge and understanding that we have. So as you think about like an overall theme, as we kind of kick off this sermon, right, with really kind of a lot of rapid fire kind of activities, is the kingdom is upside down relative to the world. God's idea of blessing is very different from what the world would say their idea of blessing is. Spiritual growth, as we start those first kind of ones, being poor in spirit. Spiritual growth starts with humility. It starts with putting our dependence fully on God. But we need to focus on the key values of righteousness, of mercy, of purity, of a peacemaking. And at the end, right, persecution is not a sign of failure. But Jesus is saying this is a sign of true faithfulness. Any last thoughts this morning? Thank you for your attention. We'll start getting a little bit slower next week, where we talk about salt and light. And I think it's really going to be about what is our example and our witness to the world. So thank you, everyone.